and welcome to another episode of Tech and Test with me, Peter Johnson. And today on the show, we have Elliott Clark. Hi, Elliott.
Hi, everybody. Good to meet you.
Welcome to Tech and Test. Thank you for taking the time out to speak to me today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Good to be here. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, it's awesome. So, I'm into testing. So I like testing. Testing's really cool. And the reason testing's cool is it means people can go to sleep at night. You don't get a production call in the middle of the night where someone has to go off and fix some deployment somewhere. And when we spoke last time, I think you mentioned you like testing. And
Absolutely.
So I guess, I've been, maybe we can do some intros. So do you want to introduce yourself to the Tech and Test audience?
Sure. So I'm Elliott Clark. I'm the founder and CEO of a startup called Batteries Included. But internally, I'm still an engineer. Before that, I've been tech lead at Facebook Ads, where I did a bunch of ML. I also did ads efficiency, dev efficiency, which I got to see kind of how you make engineers keep things stable without breaking it, which goes a lot to test. And then before that, I've done distributed databases and a bunch of web front end analytics, big data. I've kind of had a tour around the industry in open source and different companies. So I have seen a lot of things and been carry the battle scars from it. And so that's I guess why we both like tests. We figured that our kind of love for them comes from seeing the results. So.
Yeah, I think it's really painful to add tests like, post development. You end up with more production issues, you end up with more technical debt, and you just end up not building a system that's robust. So testing has played like a big role in not only like in my career, but actually in building good systems. And companies I worked at where the systems have been like scalable and reliable have done a lot of testing. That's been in their engineering culture. So the only thing that I'm interested in getting at is with this new sort of AI wave is kind of like how does testing change with like deployment of ML, non-deterministic, kind of like stochastic models and that kind of thing. So you haven't got this determinism that used to be there for like decades. And now it's all, probability based. So that is like a big challenge. And I just wondered, like, what are your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I think testing kind of ML models, the thing you've got to start understanding is that they are statistical models. And so you've got to start reaching for statistical tools to solve statistical problems, right? So I found really, really great success in using things like t-tests, student t-tests, paired student t-tests, and using those to kind of tease out what has changed from A to B, whether that be the model or your code around the model or data inputs to the model. A lot of that can come down to, did it make a change that I like or dislike? And oftentimes in these kind of ML worlds, that's not a binary green, it passed the unit test, red, it didn't pass the unit test. It's a much more fuzzy thing, and statistics really are the tool to reach for that.
So it's interesting. I really don't want to bring up the concept of like technical interviews and like how that's like a whole episode in itself, like how we do, behavioral, technical, that sort of stuff. But
Absolutely.
actually, like how do we need to change like the interview process for, incorporating more AI in some loops maybe? Because, the fact that someone can solve, let's say, medium or hard leak code problem and they've got some good behavioral interviews behind them that can show some strong signals in different areas. How much does that actually help someone if we have to do more testing with AI and we have to use AI more, in our work, should we be changing that process so that we can see if someone's got the right critical thinking skills and, statistics that can kind of get the right results?
I think there's definitely some room to improve current hiring practices for sure. I think for me, the biggest thing really is a person's ability and drive to go learn those new things. I don't expect that engineers already know statistics, right?
Mm.
That's probably something that you remember back from college or high school, and it, you're not going to know it off the top of your head. But seeing that someone can see that problem requires the tool, and then have the ability to go learn about the new, yeah, here's how we do statistical testing, or here's how we do, X, Y, and Z. Having that intellectual curiosity to go tease out whether this is the right solution for them, I think is something that, if you can find it in those initial interviews, is super, super important. Anyone that really can be trained will pick them up quite well. It's a weekend or a week project to kind of go figure it out. But the people that want to go do that are the real diamonds in the rough.
Yeah. They're the ones doing it already, right?
Yeah, they're the ones that have a story of, I tried it at home because I saw this cool article and I wanted to see whether it would work on this thing or that thing. Um, those people that can show you that they've, gone and dug in on something, probably already are gonna be those that can learn it for you.
Awesome.
So for me, I think testing's this kind of thing that I've learned to love and value, and you pretty much always have a time that you can point back to and say, this is the time that I learned the value of testing. I wonder what that story is for you, and maybe we can just kind of go back and forth on those stories, figure out where our shared loves come from, right?
Yeah, so for me, testing has always been painful. That like in the sense of it's come from pain, right? So pain being there's been a missed bug in production somewhere, or a customer's raised an issue, and then it's been like, right, what went wrong? So because I work in QA, because I work in testing, whatever we call those words, I don't know if they still exist in every company, but there is still some testing that happens in every company, right? So whether there's a QA org or there isn't a QA org, someone is writing tests somewhere, hopefully, to make sure the product that we have is robust, reliable, scalable, blah blah blah. Now, the for me, it's been really seeing the pain that a customer has had, and then trying to see take the steps back and go, what went wrong in our development process? Maybe we didn't write enough unit tests. Maybe a system test failed, or no one can notice, or there wasn't the dashboards that people could actually notice that happened. So for me, it's been a lot of those stories that have driven me into testing. And testing for me has also been, I'm curious, right? I want to know why things work the way they are. And if I'm developing a small feature somewhere for like an API endpoint, I don't always get to see the system holistically and understand the use case. And that troubles me. So,
So that for me is that's what draws me in, that I want to understand it, right?
yeah.
I want to tease it apart. I would always take things apart and then try and put them back together as a kid. And testing is just the way to do that for me for code. I need somewhere to dive in. I need somewhere to pull apart, right? And so that resonates just so much with me. But do you have a time that you wished you had a test, and from then on, that was kind of what you drew back to as your time that you're always like, yeah, see, this is why it's worth it, because I had to do this when it was broken that one time.
I think sometimes, yeah, there's loads of those stories, right? But one of them is for me, it was supposed to be an internal tool that's not, internal is still can be quite impactful depending on how many people are using internal tools. And there was because it was an internal tool, there wasn't the performance testing that needed to happen for this internal tool. And then it got rolled out internally, and everyone started to use it, and things started to come to a big halt really quickly. And fundamentally, it was the sequel. The sequel wasn't particularly profiled well, and there wasn't a test to show what happens when everyone in the company tries to access that tool. And that was kind of an embarrassing moment for the engineering team, because it was, this was the announced in big meetings, announced, with management involved, and it's like, right, everyone's using it, it's broken. And so that, you can kind of avoid. Luckily, that wasn't like a massive scale production system with like millions of users. So it's good to learn from those small mistakes and make sure they don't happen in, when you're doing large scale deployments. So performance testing still needs to be done depending on your user base. And I think some simple things like that are missed sometimes. People start creating a prototype, it works for a few hundred users. There's no bottleneck in necessarily at that point, but it's kind of thinking ahead and going, right, what happens when we start scaling this out, right? Are we going to do some profiling on our SQL queries already to sort of preempt what's going to happen down the line?
Yeah. I, that totally resonates with me. And the performance one is actually one of the first ones that came to mind. I built a system for a company and, tested it and it worked great and all of these things. And I just didn't know the way they used it. So it
Mm.
was basically a CRM type thing. And so I tested it that, people went through the pipeline from one end to the other. But in reality, the tickets would ping pong back and forth, 10 or 15 times before they were finished. And I never tested that use case, right? How this tool would be used. And so for me, that was really the moment where I was like, I've got to make sure I incorporate with how the tool is actually being used and not my assumption of how it's going to be
Mm.
used. Right. And that almost embarrassment of confidently declaring that it was going to work, but then not actually knowing how it was going to be used. That one just kind of that imprinted on my soul, right? So the embarrassment of being wrong after you tell people that it's
Mm.
ready has driven a lot of my. All right, I don't want to be that again. I want to test to make sure I can be confident. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good point. I think confidence is what testing brings to the table, right? You can have a merge request or pull request or whatever you want to call this, change list that like has all your features. But unless you've got like some actual concrete data to show that this thing works, you're almost relying on, the users doing the testing, which is never a great strategy. Um,
yeah. Have you ever heard of structured fuzzing?
Kind of. What do you mean by that? Is that where you get your users to do some of the chaos testing for you?
Kind of. So fuzzing started out as the computer will give you some raw bytes and you try and see whether you can parse it. Um, but instead of that, you can give the computer some idea of the structure that you want, and then it will fuzz by creating that input. So I found really great success by using that as input into how my system could behave, how
Mm.
people are calling it, right? They're calling it with 6 API calls in a row, followed by a delete. Does that work? Right. And that kind of unpredictability of the input that a computer can give you that your assumptions won't. I've had really good results of I make an assumption of I know what my product would do or what my system would do. And then the computer comes along and says, but have you considered this completely off the wall thing? The other place I've seen really great results with that is using structured fuzzing to change the production inputs or production requests that are coming in. So you have production traffic that's coming in. That is what you care about, right? That's the what's real. If you can take that real requests and send them to a shadow place, and then give them a little nudge. So they're almost production, but behave a little different. You'll find a lot of different ways that your software is not going to behave correctly, but are really close to what you could hit in production. So those kind of ways have been super, super cool tools that I've found recently.
Yeah. What I love about what you said is you're not trying to predict every single use case, right? You like trying to keep track of every single possible use case is, it's just not really something a human can do. Because there's always, even if you ask your customer, you say you're customer obsessed and you ask your customer and say, what are all the use cases? There's always going to be something they've missed, right? So
Yeah.
I quite like where it's, kind of based on probability to some degree on, some randomness that, and this is maybe where a point where AI can kind of step in and generate, some test case input for you where it's not necessarily just driven by a human inputting keys and, or building up these mental models on use cases, which always tend to be somewhat wrong because there's
Yeah.
always that additional requirements creeps in. So yeah, that's really
That little
cool.
bit of data that you didn't know, that little bit
Yeah.
of data that's changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think ML's probably a good way to look at for traffic generation, for creation of things that go into your system to see whether it's going to fail or behave differently than you expected. Absolutely.
Yeah, and the other thing I've noticed as well is when you work with a particular customer or a particular team, you can end up customizing the solution very closely to that customer's needs. And another customer comes along and they have a slightly different use case, and that's where it tends to go bang because suddenly that, let's say SQL query that would have been quite easy to run for the other customer A, customer B, it takes a lot longer, and it's because it's accessing different data, and suddenly the system needs to be re-architected. So yeah,
Yeah. Have you had good results from using ML for any performance testing?
it's a good question. Not necessarily for performance yet. So at the moment, I'm using it in a lot of like functional testing. So what I mean by
Yeah.
functional testing is, does the system work from a very user perspective, right? For performance testing, if I'm being very honest, it is not so much with ML, purely because I haven't spent the time maybe doing that, and I think it's something to explore. Um, it looks like have you done stuff with performance testing in ML?
Not straight ML, but yes, with traffic generation and statistical traffic generation with seeded inputs. Yeah. You take some traffic that you've recorded and ask different statistical tools to change it up to make it look
Mm.
like what you're seeing in production or what you're seeing in, and you say, just let the computer make these changes for me and see what happens. Um, yeah, you'll oftentimes find that there's a big performance change that you'll find that you didn't find by just
Yeah.
having your same unit tests run and run or your same benchmarks run and run. Having some variability in those means you find new patterns. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what this is about, right? Finding a pattern of use and then trying to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, exactly. And then I've had pretty good luck with having different patterns that are hand created, but having the computer decide different amounts of those different traffic
Mm.
patterns and
Yeah.
using that to find performance, right? So while I was at Facebook, I worked on an open source project called HBase, which powered Messenger at the time. And so we had a big tool that would create a giant linked list, and then we would go walk the linked list to make sure all data was there. We then started adding more and more workloads that started looking and behaving and having, performance characteristics that were like some other problem that we found or some other workload that, we had that were important at Facebook. And so adding those kind of workers while also verifying that we didn't break things gave us kind of a unit test plus a performance test at the same time. And that was super, super powerful for us.
Yeah, I can see that. And you're not relying on someone just like generating the next profile, right? So,
Yeah, yeah, you get to learn from each time. At Facebook, there's something called Sev Review, where anytime there's a big site-wide incident, you know,
mhm.
you firefight it, you fix it, and then you go back and you explain how you're going to make sure this never happens again. Adding, hey, we have an integration test that does all of these things, and I've added something that also exercises this behavior that we found in this incident really just means that you don't make the same mistakes over again. You make new and interesting ones, which is really what engineering is supposed to be about, right? Go make new, interesting mistakes, not the same ones.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there should be a learning exercise from every time there's like one of those incidents, right? When something hasn't quite gone well, it's just a learning opportunity to go, okay, what needs changing, right? Do we need the tool changing, the process changing? Do we need to stricten up what we do in our pipelines? Like, there should always be some sort of change that comes out of that. If there isn't, then there's no real benefit in doing like a RC, root cause analysis, right? So,
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that I've really learned is it's not just about the incidents where the site went down. It
yeah.
also should be times when the project didn't go well, right? We had this project to add on the new feature and they said it was going to be, a 1 week thing, but because of our architecture, it took them 2 months. Okay, well, that's a time to go back and do root cause analysis and say, all right, where was our code super brittle? What were the tools that you needed to have built that weren't built? Where were the tests that could have explained how this worked so that you just read the tests and changed that rather than having to spend so long, right? That kind of larger
Mm.
set of triggers for going and back and investigating what happened, I think is super powerful.
Definitely. And, getting that data and making it more exposable, right? Like sometimes it's just like being more data driven and just saying, okay, if we're making this decision, well, here's the data to back it up. We had so many incidents in the last X months. Actually, if you look closely, the unit test coverage on those components were actually quite low. So why is that? So I think, in one thing I think I've learned is trying to be more data driven. It's easier in some organizations than others. But I think the more you are data driven, the more the data is there. And if you're not playing politics, the data should actually guide you to finding the holes in your testing strategy or deployment strategy.
Have you found that that's kind of easy to bring into companies, or have you found that there's kind of
hmm,
challenges on bringing data driven, right? Because I've seen engineers that no one wants to be measured on how many lines of code they've created, right? That's not a
hmm,
measurement. And so much of what I've seen is kind of this knee jerk reaction
yeah.
to, oh, it's gonna be this awful, bit top down, you must write this many lines of code before you're allowed to leave the building kind of metrics. And right, like how do you get around that?
Wow, yeah, that's a good point. I think the thing is, when you say data driven, people jump for the easiest metrics, right? The easiest metrics are coverage, unit test coverage, lines of code, branch coverage, all that sort of stuff. Very easy to measure. And actually, the difficult stuff is where we need to spend time on, like what is actually useful. But this is down to company culture because if you're, let's say, you're really sort of customer focused, then you may want to not take it too much on the engineering process, but like, what is the customer feeling, right? How many support issues do we have? What's the kind of sentiment on this feature? So, it really depends on the organization culture. Like, I know some organizations are more customer focused than others, and
Mhm.
you can kind of see that in the metrics they gather, in the data they collect. But it is hard, right? Because it requires a culture of engineering honesty where we're not trying to hide any data and the data speaks for itself. And what can happen, I think, is some people like to gamify the data and like just show that actually, I've, I did this when I was working somewhere. I ended up touching 80,000 lines of code. And I just moved them because I was porting and porting code, but also refactoring it, adding unit tests, and it ended up giving me really high code coverage, high code numbers. But if you don't have the context on what the work was done, you think, oh, 80,000 lines of code were added or removed or whatever. That's a lot of code in like 3 months. But actually, what code was removed? you know, the more code we have, the more liability we have. So actually, removing code is a good thing too. So I think the problem with this is if you get a metric, someone will find a way to gamify it, and I think it's inevitable that's going to happen. But if we try to build a culture of trust and honesty, and we're not going to hit people with a stick saying they haven't committed X lines of code a day, we're doing this from like a risk perspective, it should help. But there's never going to be a perfect solution. There's always going to be people that gamify it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I found that for me, it's the how close can you get an engineer to describe what actually moves the company's business, is one of the biggest metrics, right? If everyone
mm,
is
yeah.
aligned and they all say, I know the one thing that the business wants, and everyone agrees on that one thing, then it's a lot easier to talk about metrics and say, this metric moves this lever that is the
Mm,
one thing that we talk about. But when you have this kind of unknown of what does the business really want,
Yeah.
what's the thing that we want to move forward, what's good
Mm.
changed this quarter compared to last quarter, that's when I found the gamifying really comes into play, right? It becomes
Very
how
good
can I
point.
present my
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
rather than everyone understands how this thing should be viewed.
That's very powerful, what you've just said. It's almost like we don't have an understanding of the North Star, right? Like, if we have the correct OKRs, I don't want to talk certain language, but like if we have the correct objective and key results, and those OKRs are defined by the business, then we should all be knowing what direction we're pulling in, right?
Yes.
But sometimes those OKRs are not always written down in OKRs, and sometimes in certain people's heads, and they're not always communicated to the engineering team. And then the engineering team don't always have like visibility on what levers they need to pull to get their feature that is going to drive the business forward. So maybe it's about visibility around what a business wants and what the engineering team should deliver. But it's a good
Yeah,
point.
and honesty about that too, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
being able to actually say this is what our business goal is, and that actually being the thing that when you get in for promotions or bonuses or whatever is the
yeah,
exact same thing that was talked about out there. That kind of matching up matters a lot. My wife is famous for saying this, but people do what you pay them to do,
yeah,
and they will find the levers that are actually being paid versus the levers that are being told are good. And if those two don't match, then you'll find that you're drifting from where you wanted to go versus where you're actually paying to go.
That is true. I think, and again, it's a culture thing, maybe. Like if everyone, I've worked in some startups before in the past where the CEO comes in and you work with the CEO and he's telling you all the issues he's facing. And there's that high level of transparency and trust, which comes with the transparency. So the two things come together. If you have the high level of trust, then you will get more transparency on what the business is going through. And I think when you start losing that trust, the transparency tends to drop as well. And I think it's kind of working in a place where there is both of those things, because I think that really helps with really understanding and really feeding the pulse of what the CEO is feeling within the org. And I think, but as you get larger and larger, it's a lot difficult to do that. So you need the right people doing that within, like the right VPs, for example, setting the correct OKRs or the correct business direction. So
It gets super, super powerful if you have a single statistical metric. So going back to our previous talk, if you have your goals are a number that you can measure, and then you can bring that back to a test that you have for your software or for your integration area. That also makes this kind of tying back to what you've done much easier because you can show here's where I shipped code. This
yeah,
metric that we said was the thing we wanted to moved in all of my A B tests. Off we go. Let's ship the next version of the software. That's much easier to talk about because it's
yeah.
so visible to everyone because it's so transparent, like you were saying, right? That transparency just means that you can test on it. You can use it as your North Star, even as you're writing your lines of code, you can be thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's really motivating as well as an engineer in that team, because you know what the code. Say you're increasing unit test coverage on some component, you know that that component is actually very important because it's part of this greater system that the customer is going to be using by Q2. And you can kind of go, yep, okay, I've delivered, unit test coverage and I've added some features to this thing. But it is still important, right? um, and I think mentally, like if you're in that team and you're just doing that, you may not feel that that is quite important. But if you know it's tied, there's that sort of dependency chain of how it's tied up to the North Star. It gives you that, I can go home and feel accomplished that I've achieved something a little bit towards that goal today, right?
Yeah, exactly. You feel like you moved the mountain. That mountain might have only moved a little bit, but you feel like that was your part of it that you did, and you take some ownership and some pride in that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this opens up the concept of like, engineering productivity, right? On like, in that sense of like, I feel like I'm contributing to something, and therefore, when I have my performance review or my, other thing that other colleagues or other, co-workers have to review you, because it's usually not the customer, it tends to be other people around you. It should be the customer, but your customer could be the engineer next to you if you're developing a tool for them, for example. So I think getting data like that makes a very concrete case of how you've contributed to a particular project. So I think,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but yeah, so that's cool. I really like that sort of culture where you have that high level of transparency and it's very data driven and focused. Because I think as the company scales and gets larger, you end up having to do more of that to get people on board and to sort of manage people, right? Because if you've got like teams of hundreds of thousands of people all working on big projects, having very consistent ways of measuring everyone, it becomes very important.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. One of the kind of debates that always comes up in testing is how early do you add tests? Um, I think I heard you talk earlier about how you really appreciate tests being added kind of earlier in the process. Um, I actually have the opposite opinion, right? So I was wondering if we could just kind of have a discussion on that, since we seem to have um, similar views, but a little differing in that. Um, why do you think they're so valuable as they're earlier on in development?
So let's define what we mean by tests, right? So if I'm writing, let's say, some algorithm, right, that does something,
Mhm.
I want to make sure that algorithm that I'm writing does what I think it does. And the way I demonstrate that is by writing some unit tests that show, meh, the business logic in this is kind of what I'm expecting it to be. And I can show someone those unit tests and they can go, yep, business logic is what I suppose it should be. The challenge becomes when you're starting to deal with like, that's sort of the unit. So what do we mean by unit, right? So unit, there's loads of different definitions for unit. Everyone's, got different opinions on this. So what is a unit for you? A unit test, actually.
So for me, a unit test is kind of a building block to
Mm,
building one thing that I can say that part is finished. I can now use it, right? And so
mm,
if I have a thing that I can now say, I now can remove this from my brain and I don't have to worry about it. That's one unit for me, right? Which is a very kind of gray area definition. But I really only use unit test as kind of a stepping stone to
yeah.
getting to, do I think that is good enough that I don't have to think about it?
Okay.
So I don't usually use them on smaller things because I don't need that stepping stone. And on larger ones where I'm unsure or investigating or that's kind of when I break out unit tests. So I don't have them as often. And then I find once I kind of have the system a little more together, that's when I start doing the business logic tests to prove that it does the thing that I was trying to build in whole.
So unit tests, I think it very much depends on the culture, the company culture. So, for example, for larger companies, maybe there's a mandate that everyone has to write unit tests because it's like the safest thing to do. Like, just get everyone writing unit tests. From a risk perspective, it's probably quite safe to get people to do that. I guess when you start getting to, companies and maybe startups where you're starting to prototype a lot more and you just want to get, you haven't quite nailed the market yet. So you just want to get things working more and just like testing out and risking and experimenting, then how much, burning loads of hours writing unit tests may not be as valuable as actually testing this API works as expected. So, I think that it really depends on risk, right? Risk is the main thing, which should be guiding the testing. There's no template that someone pulls out, but there kind of is. There's the testing pyramid, testing strategy, but there's no template that someone pulls out and says, this is how we do testing, right? That applies to every single org, every single project, every single
Yeah.
deadline. I think what's needed here is like a risk-based approach. And into that drives, things like, cost, when the next deliverable is due, what are the big risks if we're using this API from this startup and we don't know what their reliability is like? maybe we should try to test it out and see if that's actually stable. But we don't want to sort of put all of our eggs in that basket and it goes offline once we scale. Right, going back to my previous story about testing performance and making sure that things scale. If they haven't got the load on those systems, we don't know how they auto scale. So there's a lot of risks that need to be driven out. And testing for me is about driving out those risks as early as possible. Now, the problem is, right, when you start dealing with large teams building software, if you find a bug in a unit test, that is quite cheap and easy to repair. If you start finding bugs in like system tests, now you've stood up a system and you've probably got someone else involved testing that system, probably other engineering teams or QA teams or maybe the customer. And then if they find a bug, then I think there's like a chart which shows like the number of dollars that goes up every time someone tries to like find an issue in like higher up in the sort of testing pyramid. So I think it comes down to cost, right? If you can find most of your bugs early as possible, most of them, you won't find all of them, no such thing. But if you find most of your bugs early as possible, then it's more cost effective. And I think that's what's really driving these larger companies to kind of throw more at early testing.
Okay. So the way I see testing is basically I see tests as another system that you have to run, right? So you've got
Mhm.
your production database that you have to run, you've got your web server, your networking, your whatever,
Yeah,
and you've got your system that you use to verify and validate that the code that you're producing is okay,
right.
right? And so you want that system to do its job, but the slower that system is and the harder that system is to change, the more it's going to hurt your productivity of moving the other systems involved.
Yes.
Right. So it's a complexity trade-off that I think oftentimes we don't talk about that trade-off of I
Mm,
added a new test, I added a new thing, and it proved that we're not wrong now,
yeah,
but 9 months from now, we're going to also have to pay the cost when that test gets a little flaky or when we've changed this test 4 times because the API has changed 5 times and
yeah.
we're not actually getting anything from that system anymore other than a maintenance burden.
Yeah, that's a good point. A very good point. I don't think we've actually covered the flakiness bit and the maintenance bit, which creeps in. Right, it doesn't is not immediately there, but as time goes on, then how flaky, how stable are your tests? Right, because if it you may get a failure that fails 1 in 100 times, and then it's like, is this actually some kind of issue, or is this like an infrastructure issue or scripting problem, or then how
Is
many?
this I need the timeout to be 5 seconds longer, and so we have 10 people have made the timeout 5 seconds longer that's hiding an actual issue. Yeah, there's a lot of ways that that becomes a thing we have to be concerned about for sure.
Yeah. And then, do you start like tracking flakiness? And then that could become a project on its own, right? Where someone then has to manage and build tooling up to make sure like all of that is smooth as possible. So there is a cost here, you're right. And I think that's not always discussed a lot in like when we talk about testing, it's always focused on the benefits, why you should be testing, and but actually with this comes a lot of cost and a lot of if you're building something from the ground up, how much of your limited time and resources do you spend on doing all of that versus potentially going out of business by not developing the features that you need to be developing. So
And I think the cost becomes even more important as we start looking at ML, right? So if it takes me, you know, 5 different GPUs to load my model, I'm having to pay for an instance of
yeah,
that for however many hours the unit tests are every single time we have new unit tests running, right? And so that amount of hardware that you have to put in for model serving or for training, and those things are things that you're doing just for verification, then it becomes very dollar centric of I've spent this money. Did that money give me back something, or would I have been better spent accepting an outage for a couple of minutes, but having made more dollars with that hardware in production or saving that money and apologizing to customers?
yeah. Yeah, it's a risk thing, right? It's reputation as
Yeah.
well. Like if someone like, manages to data breach your database and bring, that's really bad reputation. Like, ooh,
Mhm.
I could be out of business now because all my customer details are leaked. Um, versus there's a small fix, we've got someone who's on call anyway who could fix that and just push it to production. So it's kind of, I don't know. I think it comes back to risk again. It's like, um, how much risk, do we want to take as a business or organization? Um, and some companies don't really have the same like level of QA because they know there's someone there that's going to, if there's a broken, build and production, someone's going to roll back and, fix it. So it's all about levels of risk. Some companies don't want to take this risk because it could be a piece of firmware that gets like, flashed into millions of devices that they don't want to, put the wrong piece of firmware in there that doesn't boot, for example. And that's quite a high risk because it's like, you could close a factory doing stuff like
Yeah.
that.
I think you also hit on something that's very interesting that a lot of companies rely on. The one expert that everyone kind of assumes will catch everything, that is definitely a pattern I've seen a lot where there's
Mm-mm.
the one super expert who almost is their own, test team all in and of themselves, right? They are the ones that can find an issue just by looking at it and telling you that's going to be a problem. Finding those kind of engineers and giving them the power to say that's going to be a problem, roll it back, or don't push it forward, or have you thought about something else? Those engineers are worth their weight in gold if you can find them.
Yeah. The ones like who don't just do what, you're paid to do, but go above and beyond and take the ownership of like the system, right? Because I think if you're engaged as an engineer, you own what you're producing and you own the processes. And if they're not right, you would make sure they are right, even if it's not written in your job spec. And I think those are the ones that are really valuable because they just end up doing the right thing and not, even if that means not always following the process to a T because the process may be wrong in that instance, right?
Exactly, exactly. They're the ones that just won't accept anything other than it works well and I don't get called on call, right? They're
Yeah.
the ones that really just hold a standard and they hold that standard for themselves first, but then because the org sees that standard, you get a better result.
Absolutely. So testing for you, testing in general is very multifaceted, right? It touches on culture in terms of like the company's culture. It touches on risk, touches on different tools, like you mentioned, right? Like, statistical tools. And I think all of this is really based on risk. And because, the more risk you want to take, the less dollars you can spend on testing.
Mhm.
But the less risk you want to take, the more dollars you got to spend on testing. So kind of like it's, um, but then there's also the risk of spending loads of dollars on testing, but testing the wrong things. So
Yes.
it's, yeah, it requires a lot of things, a lot of data. And how often do people actually look at their test suites and go, all of these tests have not found any issues in the last X whatever. Are they actually valuable? I'm spending, CPU cycles running this. Um, do
How
I?
what the rate that this unit test ever fails is a super interesting metric where you'll find that 5 or 10% of your unit tests are the ones that catch
Mhm.
basically every bug, right? And so then you have a what is the long tail of my unit tests worth, right? What's the one that asserts foo equals foo and bar equals bar really worth to you? I don't know, right? That, like you're saying, is a risk versus reward kind of thing that each org has to take, right? And the bank that says I have total concern if even a single thing is wrong, they're going to dial down that risk. Whereas the startup that just absolutely needs someone to try their product are going to say the risk is worth it. Let's push forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes back down to like what we were discussing earlier, right? About gamifying metrics. If someone is writing tests to reach a certain, unit test coverage or whatever, then you may end up throwing in tests which are less valuable just to make sure that that metric has been met, that code path has been met, right? And is it the most valuable test you could be writing? Could you be writing a much more valuable test with that time? And
Yeah.
those are the sort of things that can, when we start talking about data driven and, focusing on metrics, they can kind of cloud decision making around these kind of things. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
big numbers are easy to say they're awesome.
yeah.
While it's kind of hard to say that my one line fix actually meant so much. Right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's harder to sell that one line fix, which could have taken 12 hours to actually write, versus, I've increased the coverage to 100%, 90%, whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah. While that's true, some of my kind of biggest wins that I've had have been changes that change tons and tons of code. I think I've had really great um, success making tools that change code, right? So I think about it as like in woodworking, you make a jig before you're going to go do something.
Yeah.
Making a little tool to help you go make changes around an org can kind of multiply your success. And oftentimes that means you have a lot of code that you change without having to do a lot for each of the lines of code, but the impact can still be outsized, right? It's not the size of the change in code, but it's
No.
still more than if I did it piecemeal one at a time, right? So it's somewhere in there, and finding that kind of power of building your own tools to go change or test other people's code, I found has been super, super impactful.
Yeah, that's a good point. How much of it can be automated, right? In a reliable, safe way that doesn't require well, there's going to be human error sometimes, right? When we do work. So
Yeah.
if some of this can be done by tools, then it takes some of that load off. Um, you don't want to work on a system where you have to keep updating like 80,000 lines of code a week to keep it running, right? So, um,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
well, maybe you can if you've got a tool that does that for you and you just change some config and off you go. But
Yeah. Which the bigger companies do have, right? If you
yeah,
have large investments in Clang and you see that, a lot of that investment is because you can use LLM as a backend for other tools, right? So your giant companies can move C++ mono repos in ways that kind of you don't think are possible, because you can build tools on top of LLVM and then ensure that your C++ is still valid and good just as much as it was before. And then you have the unit tests suite that you've invested in for years. So yeah, you can move the world a lot with some kind of automated code mods for sure.
definitely. But I think it all depends on resource and how much you want to throw at this, right?
Yeah.
Well, what size of operation are you, do you bring in that you can actually invest in those tools and invest in those processes where really comes down to the bottom line of like how much impact and value are what we're working on bringing in, right, to begin with.
Yeah. And part of that for me, I think comes back to the community, right? So the can you find those tools already being worked on is such a big deciding factor, right? So you can find those pretty easily in Rust, for example, because it's the new hot language that everyone
Yeah.
loves. So the community is behind that and building those tools. You can find the mutation testers, you can find the fuzzers, you can find those already for you. And so you can stand on the shoulders of giants to get those without having to build them. You want to do this in C++, and it's a much harder
Yeah.
road to go because you're doing it almost by yourself, and that's where you've got to be the Googles or the Facebooks of the world before that kind of
Mm.
risk benefit comes off. So I think looking at the community to help you on that kind of cost benefit analysis really can pay off a lot, and Rust is currently the best at it because it's the shiniest. At least that's how
Yeah.
I've seen it lately.
Yeah, definitely. Rust is definitely, even for Python, in the Python world, right? There's like tooling that's come in from Rust, like Rough, for example, like a Python insert, and there's other tools like for managing like Python packages, and all of that's come from Rust as well. So because it's the new shiny thing that people are jumping onto it, and I guess more and more. I think it's even gone into some kernel changes, Rust. I think so. Like eventually, everybody was starting to do a bit more Rust. I think eventually.
Yeah.
It's just naturally the way things are going, but it does require leaning into like the new shiny thing, right? Which for some orgs, they're like very risk. Like we're not going to be using LLMs. We're not going to be using generative AI. We're not going to be using things we don't know about because we've done things like this for so long. And maybe there's like real valid reasons for doing that. Like maybe if you're in like a very sensitive environment with securities like national security sort of things need to be tested out properly before you just take the next community project that comes along, because it could have like gaping holes in it, for example. But for most people, use cases, I think it's a no brainer, right? To leverage where most of the energy is going in the open source community and just using those tools. Like, why wouldn't we want to like improve them and help them? And then everyone wins, I guess, right? We can all use the rough Pylin's equivalent. So yeah.
Yeah, and you get the new testing because someone else found it and stubbed their toe for you, because there's so many people
Yes.
wandering around in the same area. You get a little bit of that assuredness without you having to be the one that found the problem yourself.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you, Elliot. I think some interesting discussions we've been speaking about, like the pros and cons of testing, and I came into this thinking, testing is of course something we all do, right? And actually, one thing I've taken away from this conversation is there's testing is important. Like no testing's bad, but some testing's good, or more testing's good. But it's not a simple equation that we all. There's an element of cost associated with testing, and I think um, considering that cost versus like the benefit of just moving faster is something we always have to think about. And as the kind of organizations these days, you have to be very lean because you don't know what feature the customer wants tomorrow. So I think times are changing where we're not building like shipping features at like the rates we were before. Now it's even faster, right? With AI, there's more expectation that things will be done quicker. I think there is that expectation, whether it's inherently there or it's like directly in your face. I think businesses are moving faster because of AI, and I think that expectation is there. And maybe with that also comes, look, because we know these models are probabilistic and not deterministic. As consumers, maybe we're starting to change our mindset and approach to things may not always be right 100% of the time. Because if you think of an LLM model, it's not always going to give you the correct answer. And sometimes people can start to be more forgiving, maybe. And with that, maybe will come a change in culture in how, we evaluate systems going forwards. But who's to say?
I think you're right. I think we'll be a little more scientists in computer science. We'll have to be doing a little more experimentation where we actually go in with a hypothesis that we're not actually sure whether it's null or not, right? And so finding that out and doing that in a way where we acknowledge that we don't know all of the answers, I
Yeah.
think is going to lead us to make better software. There's a lot of stuff to learn there, but I think you're right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's like we don't always know the answer of what we're shipping, right? We can bring all the data into something and it's going to make a decision, and that's as best as we can do. And if that's wrong, then we need to go back and reevaluate. But there's going to be many times where we're just going to push the button on things in production and we're not going to know 100% what it's going to output. And that mindset is going to change maybe how we approach testing and change how customers even like consume these like products as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Elliot, thank you for coming on Tech and Test. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always up for talking testing, and been a really insightful conversation. So thank you so much.